The fluorescent lights above the pediatric ICU hummed their endless monotone as Rachel Torres clipped her temporary badge to the pocket of her scrubs, making sure the tarnished challenge coin stayed hidden in the fold beneath. For months into this assignment at Cedar Creek Medical in Philadelphia, and she had perfected the art of being invisible. The antiseptic smell hung thick in the corridor, that particular blend of bleach, saline solution, and the metallic undertone of fear that only a children's intensive care unit could produce. She'd learned to breathe through it without flinching, the way she'd learned to breathe through worse. The ICU stretched before her in soft blues and grays. 12 beds arranged in a semicircle, each one surrounded by the machinery of modern medicine, ventilators, cardiac monitors, infusion pumps, the architecture of hope and desperation built from plastic and steel. It was 6:07 on a Tuesday morning, that narrow window between night shift and day shift where the ward belonged to no one and everyone. 2 nurses were already charting at the central station. 3 residents stood in a cluster near bed 7, voices pitched low, the particular tone of people discussing something they didn't want the patients' families to hear. Rachel moved through the space with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, somewhere, in some other life, in some other capacity that no one here was supposed to know about. She didn't stride. She didn't command attention. She moved like someone who belonged in the background, like a piece of equipment that nobody noticed until it was needed. Her scrubs were immaculate. Her shoes were quiet on the tile floor. Her hands were steady, the kind of steady that came from having held worse things than coffee cups. At the medication station, she began pulling charts for the morning rounds. Room 3 had a 7-year-old with aspiration pneumonia. Room 5 held an infant recovering from a bowel resection. Room 8 was empty, they'd lost that patient 2 days ago, a 16-month-old with severe sepsis and a mother who still hadn't stopped crying in the family waiting room. Rachel didn't think about room 8. That wasn't how this worked. Thinking led to trembling, and trembling led to mistakes, and mistakes led to being noticed. The medication error appeared on the chart for bed 6 like a crack in a windshield, small at first, then spreading into the whole picture if you looked at it the right way. A pediatric patient, 7 years old, admitted with undiagnosed cardiac tamponade, fluid pressing against the heart, suffocating it slowly from the inside. The attending had ordered a diuretic, Lasix, 40 mg for standard protocol for reducing fluid load, except that this patient's blood pressure was already 82/51. A diuretic would push that pressure further down, accelerate the deterioration, maybe even trigger the very cardiac crisis everyone was trying to prevent. Rachel pulled the chart forward. She read it twice. Once silently, once aloud in her head, the way they'd taught her to do at Coronado during the emergency medical technician certification that she absolutely did not have and that did not exist anywhere in her official record. The prescription was there in Dr. Caldwell's handwriting, arrogant strokes, letters that leaned too far to the right, the signature of someone who had never been told no. She walked to the central station. The 2 nurses barely glanced up. One of them was new, maybe 3 months in, and the other was Marcus, a nurse with 14 years of ICU experience who had learned long ago not to question orders from the attending physicians. Rachel placed the chart on the desk in front of them. Bed 6, Rachel said. Her voice was soft, the kind of voice that didn't demand anything. The Lasix order. I think there's a contraindication. Marcus didn't look up from his computer. Caldwell ordered it. I know. The patient's already hypotensive. Diuretics going to crater the pressure further. Might tip into cardiogenic shock. The new nurse was still staring at her screen. Marcus still hadn't moved. Rachel stood there for 3 seconds, perfectly composed, perfectly patient, the way you stand when you're a temporary nurse with no credentials and no authority and no real stake in anything except doing the job right. I'll leave a note, Rachel said. She turned to walk away, but Marcus's voice stopped her. Not unkind, just dismissive. Caldwell's been doing this a long time. Rachel nodded. She didn't argue. She walked back to the medication station and made a note in the chart, a careful, professional notation that the temporary nurse assigned to this rotation had observed a possible medication interaction and recommended verification of the order before administration. She signed it with her temporary credentials. Teresa M. Raymond, RN, temporary contract. By 07:23, the note had caught the attention of the pharmacist doing morning review. By 07:41, the order had been changed. The Lasix was cancelled. A low-dose inotropic agent was added instead, something to support the heart without throwing the fluid balance further out of equilibrium. The patient's blood pressure stabilized. The cardiac compression remained, undiagnosed, waiting, but at least she wouldn't be killed by the treatment meant to save her. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 08:07, moving through the ICU like a man who owned it, because he did own it, or thought he did, in the way that attending physicians own departments and hospital boards listen to their calls because they bring insurance contracts worth millions. He was tall, with the kind of face that hospitals hired, salt and pepper hair, expensive watch with a leather band, the bearing of someone who had never lost a negotiation in his life. He moved through the ward reviewing charts, his residents trailing behind him in a disciplined cluster, the way schools of fish follow the largest member because instinct says the largest member probably knows where the food is. Rachel was in room 4, adjusting the 4 line on a 6-year-old with meningitis, when she heard Caldwell's voice spike from bed 6. Not angry. Just sharp. The kind of sharp that cuts because it's precise. Who pulled the Lasix? One of the residents fumbled. Pharmacist flagged a contraindication, sir. The patient's pressure was. I know the pressure. I ordered the medication because I know the pressure. Call down to pharmacy. I want to know who made that decision. Rachel didn't turn around. She finished adjusting the 4, checked the infusion rate one more time, and moved to room 5 to assess the infant's surgical site. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The challenge coin in her pocket remained exactly where it had been since she arrived at Cedar Creek 4 months ago, hidden, safe, forgotten. But Caldwell was already making phone calls. By noon, he would be on the line with the director of nursing. By 1400, he would be in a closed-door meeting with the hospital administrator, discussing the concerning pattern of temporary staff making clinical judgment calls that superseded attending physician orders. By 1600, he would have filed a formal complaint about credentials and scope of practice and whether temporary contract nurses should even have access to medication charts. None of it was true. All of it would be believed. Rachel didn't know any of this yet. She moved through the rest of the morning shift like she moved through every shift, competent, invisible, leaving no trace except for the patients who didn't die, the families who got to keep their children, the small resistances of a person who had been trained to care for people under fire and who now cared for them under fluorescent lights instead. It wasn't until 1447, near the end of her shift, that the real complication arrived. The paramedics brought him in on a stretcher, a man in his late 60s with salt-stained clothing and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been sitting bedside for hours. Behind him came the patient, a boy, maybe 8 years old, pale as paper, moving with the careful slowness of someone whose chest hurt with every breath. The man was announcing himself in a voice tight with desperation. Commander Marcus Vega, Coast Guard. This is my son. His name is Daniel. He's been complaining about chest pain and difficulty breathing for 3 days and the pediatrician said it was anxiety, said to bring him to the ER if it got worse, and it got worse, it got so much worse. Rachel was at the central station when they passed through the pediatric ICU entry doors. She watched the boy, the way his skin had the particular grey pallor of cardiac compromise, the way he held his arm against his ribs like the pressure helped the pain. She watched the father, the military bearing still evident despite the chaos of trying to keep his child alive. The admitting resident, Dr. Patterson, was already moving. Get him to bed too. I want a cardiac panel, chest X-ray, 12-lead EKG, and an echostat. Call cardiology. I want them now. The boy was already in the bed, forgoing into his left arm, the EKG leads being applied to his small chest. Rachel moved with the team, pulling equipment, setting up the monitor. The cardiac display came to life, a rhythm that was too fast, a pattern that suggested compression, something pressing against the heart from the outside. Her hands continued their work. Her face revealed nothing. And that was when she heard the voice. That's a Coronado 3 movement insertion. Rachel didn't stop moving. She was reaching for a central line kit, preparing to get better vascular access because this boy's blood pressure was dropping and they would need that access in the next 60 seconds. But she went very still for one breath, one moment where time folded in on itself. Behind her, leaning against the corner of the medication station, stood a man in his 50s with the build of someone who had spent his life training other people's bodies to function under stress. His hair was close-cropped. His eyes were tracking her hands, watching the way she was setting up, the economy of movement, the precision that didn't belong to a temporary contract nurse. He was wearing a visitor's badge. His name tag read, James Garrett, former hospital volunteer. But his eyes said something else entirely. His eyes said, I know exactly who you are. Grand round started at 7:42 a.m. on a Thursday, which meant 12 residents clustered around the senior staff like medical students at a dissection. The ICU amphitheater smelled of coffee and hand sanitizer, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical song overhead. Rachel stood at the back near the medication cart, updating charts while Dr. Caldwell presented a case from the night before, a septic patient, crashing vitals, a code that had lasted 14 minutes. He was good at this. That was the problem. Caldwell had the kind of voice that made residents lean forward, the kind of presence that made mistakes sound like educational moments instead of what they actually were. He wore a Rolex that caught the light whenever he gestured, and his suit probably cost more than Rachel's entire rent deposit. Old money. Inherited privilege. The kind of institutional power that made him untouchable. Now, Caldwell said, turning slightly toward Rachel, let me show you what happens when someone with insufficient training interprets vital signs. His voice was pleasant. Almost gentle. Our temporary staff member yesterday noted a slight pressure reading and recommended we check the mediastinum. Recommended. Not ordered. Not assessed independently. Rachel's hand didn't pause. She kept writing. Kept breathing. Of course, she then charted that this patient had a normal chest X-ray when in fact, he clicked to a slide showing obvious fluid. The radiograph clearly showed pulmonary infiltration consistent with early tamponade. She didn't read the image. She didn't read the labs. She saw what she wanted to see. One of the residents glanced back at Rachel. Then looked away. The lesson here is that temporary staff, no matter how well-intentioned, lack the foundational knowledge necessary for independent clinical decisions. They see crisis where there is protocol. They create problems that simply don't exist. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had never been wrong in his life, or at least never been corrected. Some people are suited for this work. Others are just filling gaps until we find someone qualified. The words landed in the room like a blade through water, smooth, certain, lethal. Rachel turned a page in her chart. The pen moved in her hand with the same pressure, the same speed. Her jaw didn't tighten. Her chest didn't constrict. She had absorbed worse under mortar fire, so this was manageable. This was just sound waves and institutional theater. But the lie sat there in the light of those fluorescent tubes like a thing with weight. She had read the chest X-ray correctly. She had flagged the infiltration at 03 for 7 hours. She had recommended intervention at the exact moment Caldwell was now claiming she had missed it entirely. The medication error she had corrected, the one that would have supported his fraudulent billing, now became her incompetence. He had simply inverted the facts and delivered them to 12 future physicians who would repeat this story for years. The residents filed out in clusters, and one of them, a woman with her name badge pinned crooked, muttered something to her neighbor about temps thinking they know more than they do. Rachel heard it. She was meant to hear it. The vending machine was on the 3rd floor near the back stairwell, a humming box of terrible coffee and stale crackers. Rachel fed a dollar bill into the slot at 8:16 a.m., her shift officially over, her 12-hour rotation ending the way most of them did now, in quiet, in isolation, in the systematic erasure of her presence. The coffee button took the bill and dispensed a cup that steamed faintly. 2 orderlies rounded the corner, both of them young, both of them laughing about something before they saw her. Their faces shifted. Not guilty, just aware that she was there. That's the temp Caldwell was talking about, one of them said. His name was Marcus, and he'd been nice to her the first 2 weeks. The one who can't read a chart. Doesn't understand infiltration, the other one added. His smile was the kind that came from having power over someone with no defense. Needs to stick to bed baths, right? Rachel turned to face the vending machine again. She retrieved her coffee from the slot. The cup was hot enough to burn if she'd let it, but her hands didn't flinch. She had been a Navy corpsman for 14 years before the Coast Guard transfer, and Navy corpsmen treated pain like information. This was just the civilian version, Shane dispensed in 8-ounce cups. You hear us? Marcus stepped closer. His shoulder almost touched hers. We're talking to you. I heard you, Rachel said. Her voice came out level. Calm. The voice of someone reporting a lab value, not someone being publicly humiliated by medical orderlies in a hospital corridor. She took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like burnt rubber and regret. So what, you're just going to stand there? The second orderly, whose name she didn't know and had no reason to learn, laughed. That's what I'm saying. No comeback. No spine. You're just temp staff. Rachel walked toward the stairwell. Neither of them tried to stop her. They didn't need to. The work was already done. Dr. Caldwell found her in the medication dispensary at 9:07 a.m. She was verifying an order for heparin, standard procedure, automatic work, the kind of task that required no thought and all of her focus. His voice came before his shadow appeared in the doorway. Rachel. Not Ms. Torres. Not her last name. Just Rachel, the way someone addresses a housekeeping contractor or a temporary staffing agency mistake. A word. She didn't look up from the dispensary screen. Of course, Doctor. Your presence on the unit is becoming difficult. I understand you have thoughts about my treatment protocols. Clinical observations. His tone made the words sound like accusations. I want to be clear. If you question my clinical decisions again, if you so much as suggest an alternative approach in front of staff or residents, I'll have security escort you from the building. Rachel looked at him then. His expression was pleasant. His hands were relaxed at his sides. He was a man who had spent his entire professional life never having to fight for anything because the system was already built to protect him. His power wasn't strength. It was permission. I understand, Rachel said. I'm not sure you do. He took a step inside the dispensary. The door closed behind him with a soft hydraulic hiss. You're temporary. At-will employment. That means there is no protection for you here. No union. No grievance process. If I call the staffing agency and tell them you're a liability, you're gone by lunch. If I call security and tell them you're harassing medical staff, you're gone by lunch. If I tell the hospital board that you're outside your scope of practice, you're gone by lunch. Do you understand those words? She nodded once. Just once. Her face showed him nothing, not anger, not fear, not the compliance of someone being threatened. Just the neutral expression of someone receiving information. Her hands remained at her sides, steady as a sniper's rifle sight. Good. Caldwell turned to leave. I hope we won't have this conversation again. Rachel watched him go. The dispensary door closed. The fluorescent light above her head continued its mechanical hum, patient and indifferent to the small dramas of hospital life. She thought about the challenge coin in her locker, the one that bore the insignia of a unit that officially never existed. She thought about the 17 sailors she had brought home from Ramadi while the Pentagon decided that entire operation was classified beyond recovery. She had been a Master Chief Petty Officer. She had trained 12 men and women in combat medicine. She had made decisions under fire that saved more lives than most doctors did in entire careers. Now she was temporary staff who couldn't read a chart. But that wasn't the worst part. The monitor alarm started at 0306. 3 short beeps that punched through the quiet like a fist through glass. Rachel was already moving before the second beep finished, muscle memory pulling her from the break room toward the pediatric ICU without conscious thought. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone as she crossed the threshold, and there, bed 7, where Commander Vega's son Daniel had been sleeping soundly 2 hours ago, now the numbers were screaming. 88 beats per minute climbing to 110. Blood pressure dropping like a stone down a well, 94/62. And the oxygen saturation was tanking. 91/88. Falling. His crashing, the night resident called out, his voice already showing the hairline fractures of panic. Dr. Marcus Chen, first-year postdoc, brilliant on paper and utterly drowning in this moment. Rachel could see it in the way he stood frozen at the bedside, staring at the monitors as if they might explain themselves. Cardiac tamponade, Rachel said. Not a question. The signs were unmistakable. The boy's neck veins were distended against his pale skin like cords, his breathing shallow and rapid, his small chest heaving against the weight of something pressing down on his heart from the inside. Fluid. 40, maybe 50 ccs of it accumulating in the pericardial sac, squeezing his cardiac function down to nothing. We need to call Caldwell, Chen whispered. We need a needle. Rachel was already moving toward the supplies, her voice dropping an octave. Not a request. A statement of fact. 14 gauge. 1.5 inch. And get me a syringe, 20 cc. Now. The night nurse, Curtis, fresh out of his first year, jumped at the tone. He didn't question it. He moved. This was the voice of someone who had given orders in places where hesitation ended in body bags, and something in that sound reached through the fog of his panic and made him function. His pressures dropping faster, Curtis said, pulling the supplies. 89/58. I see it. Rachel's hands were already washing, already scrubbing. Cold water, the smell of antiseptic rising like a wall. The boy's small chest was visible now, his hospital gown pulled down past his right collarbone, the pale skin marked with the thin blue highways of veins beneath the surface. He was 8 years old and his heart was suffocating. Where's Caldwell? Chen asked again, his voice cracking slightly. We're not waiting, Rachel said. She prepped the site with chlorhexidine, her touch gentle but efficient, the swab moving in concentric circles while somewhere in the building the world continued its oblivious rotation. The pericardiocentesis was a procedure that lived in the narrow space between salvation and catastrophe, a needle driven into the sac surrounding the heart, seeking fluid without puncturing the organ itself. Depth, angle, and intuition. All three had to align. The needle came up. 14 gauge. The kind that could save a life or end one depending on the steadiness of the hand holding it. Rachel's hand was steady. It had been steady in Ramadi when she was driving a needle through a seal's chest cavity to release tension pneumothorax in a room lit by muzzle flashes and the dying light of artillery fire. It had been steady through 17 extractions and 6 separate operations that the Pentagon had decided never happened. His pressures at 86, Curtis reported. Falling. She found the angle, just below the xiphoid process, driving at 45 degrees, aiming for the patient's left shoulder. The needle slid in with a sensation like pushing through leather, a resistance followed by give. The pericardial sac opened. I'm in, she said quietly. The fluid came first. Clear and amber-tinted, it flowed into the syringe like relief itself, drawing away the pressure that was crushing the boy's heart. 10 ccs. 15. The monitors began to shift. His SATS coming up, Curtis said, something like hope creeping back into his voice. 88, now 90. 20 ccs. The pressure eased with each draw. Rachel could feel it happening, that moment when the weight lifted off the cardiac muscle and the organ remembered how to work. The needle steadied in her hand, her breathing matched to the rhythm of the fluid moving through the chamber, her entire being contracted down to this single point of intervention. The oxygen kept climbing. 92, 94. The heart rate began to normalize. 112, 108. 102, blood pressure rising like a tide coming back in 91/64. Then 96/68. Sinus rhythm, Curtis breathed, staring at the monitor. Jesus! We're back in normal sinus. Rachel withdrew the needle with the same precise control she'd used to insert it, applying pressure with gauze to the puncture site, the boy's small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm now. His color was improving. The grayish cast was leaving his lips. His oxygen saturation steadied at 96. Get him on continuous cardiac monitoring, she said, her voice still low and commanding. I need a chest X-ray to confirm pneumomediastinum. And draw labs, CBC, troponin, basic metabolic panel. If that pressure builds again, we'll have maybe 2 minutes before he crashes harder than he just did. Understood. Chen nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he moved. Now, doctor, she said. He moved. The boy's breathing had stabilized completely now, his small body no longer fighting for each breath. Rachel left her hand on his shoulder for a moment, the gesture small enough that no one else would notice, would interpret it as anything other than clinical assessment. But it was something else. It was a moment of acknowledgement between someone who had learned to save lives under mortar fire and a child who had just been given back his. It wasn't until the moment passed that she noticed him. The man standing in the doorway. Older, maybe 60, military-bearing even in the way he stood, shoulders back, weight distributed, the kind of posture that came from 30 years of habit. His uniform was civilian but his eyes were military, and they were locked on her hands. On the way she was palming the syringe with a technique that wasn't taught in any nursing school curriculum Rachel had ever encountered. The technique was taught at Coronado. Under live fire. To people who operated in places that officially didn't exist. Their eyes met for a half second. His went wide. He didn't say anything. But the recognition was already flickering across his face like lightning behind cloud cover, that moment when a soldier sees another soldier and understands instantly what that presence means. Rachel turned away, focusing on Daniel's monitors, feeling the weight of that stare between her shoulder blades like a physical thing. The night was supposed to be quiet. The night was supposed to be routine. The night was supposed to keep her safe in her temporary invisibility, just another contract nurse doing contract work. The night had just ended that arrangement. Page pediatric cardiology, she told Curtis, her voice steady despite the sudden understanding settling into her chest like cold concrete. And someone get his father. He needs to know his son is stable. The pericardiocentesis line held steady. 40 ccs of clear fluid drained into the collection chamber. The monitor climbed. 72. 81. 94. Sinus rhythm restored. The boy's chest rose on its own again. Rachel pulled the needle free with the same precision she'd used in Ramadi 3 years ago, in a compound where the walls were bleeding and the man on the stretcher had a shrapnel wound that was eating him alive. Muscle memory. Her hands didn't shake when lives depended on them. They only shook after. The room went dead silent. Dr. Caldwell hadn't even arrived yet. The on-call resident was still staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. The bedside monitor beeped its mechanical affirmation, a rhythm that meant the boy would see tomorrow. A gray-haired man in the doorway, the volunteer who'd been visiting his daughter in the unit, locked eyes with Rachel for exactly 3 seconds. Recognition flickered there. The kind of recognition that comes from having watched someone move with military precision under the kind of pressure that breaks civilians. He'd seen it before. Coronado trained. Someone who didn't just know emergency medicine, someone who'd survived it. Rachel didn't acknowledge him. She stripped the gloves. Discarded the needle into the sharps container. The metallic clink echoed in the ICU like a closing door. Call Commander Vega, she said to the nurse manager standing frozen near the monitors. His son is stable. She was already turning away when Dr. Caldwell's voice cut through the corridor, sharp and elevated. He was on his phone. Moving fast. She heard it from the hallway, the tone of a man making favors calls at 0318 in the morning, the the tone of a man who'd just realized something had happened that he couldn't spin. By 08:47, the hospital administrator called her into his office on the 4th floor. His name was Richard Hayes. He ran Cedar Creek Medical with the precision of a man who'd learned accounting before he learned compassion, who knew how to read insurance codes better than he knew his staff's names. His desk was mahogany. His coffee was imported. His expression was apologetic in the way that preceded termination. "We've received a formal complaint," he began, sliding a single sheet across the desk. The paper was warm, probably printed within the last hour. "Credential falsification. Practicing beyond the scope of a temporary nurse. It appears there are discrepancies in your background verification." Rachel read it. Didn't blink. The complaint was unsigned, dated this morning at 0634, and every word of it was a fabrication written by someone who understood hospital protocol well enough to make it sound authentic. The language was clinical. The accusations were precise. A temporary nurse with forged credentials wouldn't have passed the reference check. A temporary nurse with forged credentials would be a liability. Dr. Caldwell's handwriting showed in the margins. She could feel it even though his name wasn't there. "You're being terminated effective immediately," Hayes said. The words came out quickly, the way people speak when they're uncomfortable. "We need your badge and access card. Hospital security will escort you from the building." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Rachel set the complaint back on the desk. "I understand." Hayes blinked. He'd expected pushback. Defense. Tears. Maybe. Something. Rachel simply stood, unblemished her temporary badge from her scrub pocket, and set it on the mahogany surface next to the fabricated accusation. "There's a severance packet," Hayes continued, trying to recover his authority. 2 weeks' pay. Health coverage through the end of the month. You'll sign a non-disparagement agreement before you leave. She nodded once. The locker room was empty at 11:47 on a Thursday morning. All the day shift staff were on the floors. Rachel opened her locker, number 247, same one she'd used for 4 months, same one that had held a thin jacket and a pair of backup scrubs and the tarnished challenge coin she kept in the pocket where no one looked. She took out the coin first. Held it in her palm. The brass was dull from 30 years of being carried through deployments, turned over in uncertain moments, clutched in the dark. The emblem was barely visible now, the Coast Guard shield, scratched and worn, stamped with the call sign of a unit that technically didn't exist anymore. The unit that saved 17 sailors in Ramadi. The unit whose operation went sideways in ways that made the Pentagon decide some people were better off erased. She'd been a lieutenant commander then. She was a memory now. A liability. A problem that needed disappearing. Rachel set the coin on the bench and started folding her scrubs. Hospital corners, the way she'd been taught in basic training, fold the bottom up, fold the sides in, create geometry so precise that the stack could be set on a shelf and wouldn't shift. Her hands moved through the motions methodically. Left sleeve. Right sleeve. Bottom hem aligned perfectly with the top. Fold. Crease. Set down. Fold. Crease. Set down. By the 14th pair, her hand started to shake. Not from fear. From restraint. From the sheer force of keeping everything compressed, the rage at the fabrication, the knowledge that Caldwell had weaponized hospital protocol against her, the understanding that she'd been invisible for so long that she'd forgotten invisibility had a price. The moment you saved someone, the moment you did something that required competence beyond just a nurse, you risked exposure. She pressed her hand against the cold metal locker. Breathed. Her hand stilled. One more pair of scrubs. Then it was done. A security officer was waiting in the hallway when she walked out. Not the veteran guard who'd seen her inject the line with military precision. A younger man, early 20s, trying hard to look professional about walking a terminated employee out of the building. "I can carry that," he offered, gesturing at the cardboard box. "I've got it," Rachel said. The lobby of Cedar Creek Medical was 42 steps from the main elevators. Glass doors. Automatic opening. The morning light coming in hard and bright, the kind of light that made everything look exposed. Rachel could see the parking garage from here, the concrete stairs where she'd climbed yesterday at the end of a 12-hour shift, exhausted in the way that came from saving someone's life. She walked through the sliding doors with a single cardboard box containing everything she'd left behind: a jacket, a shift schedule, a photograph of a Coast Guard cutter she'd served on 8 years ago. The challenge coin was in her pocket. The one thing that mattered. The one thing that proved she'd existed before Cedar Creek Medical, before Philadelphia, before the Pentagon decided that Ramadi had been classified so thoroughly that it might as well have never happened. The security officer didn't follow her past the doors. Rachel stood on the concrete for approximately 9 seconds. People moved around her, visitors, staff, a few patients in wheelchairs getting fresh air therapy. No one looked at her. To them, she was invisible. A temp with a box of belongings and a temporary badge she no longer needed. She turned toward the parking garage. And that's when the rotor sound started in the distance. Distant at first. Then closer. The kind of sound that made even pedestrians stop and look up. The kind of sound that meant serious business was arriving. The emergency room doors exploded inward. EMTs wheeled a stretcher through the chaos, a man's body slick with blood, his shirt dark as oil. Gunshot wound. Massive hemorrhage. The trauma team scattered into controlled motion, and nobody noticed the woman standing in the lobby with a cardboard box until the patient's eyes found hers and locked. His lips moved. A whisper in Arabic. Seahawk. The box fell. That code name had not been spoken in 12 years. That code name belonged to someone who was supposed to be dead, officially erased, her service record buried in Pentagon vaults marked classified and buried deeper still. Nobody survived saying that word outside the operations compound in Ramadi. Nobody alive knew that call sign except the men she'd pulled out of burning vehicles and the men who'd watched her do it. Rachel did not move. Did not blink. The cardboard box lay open at her feet, scrub spilling onto the tile floor like a ghost shedding skin. Then a voice cut through the intercom static. A voice that came from the security desk. A man in a uniform 3 sizes too large, grey at the temples, moving toward her with a kind of deliberate precision that only came from muscle memory 20 years old. He'd heard the word. He recognized the language. He understood exactly what it meant. Master Chief Petty Officer on deck, he called out. Not a question. A statement. A declaration. His hand moved to his chest, fist striking once in the ancient salute of men who'd bled together. 3 other people in the lobby moved simultaneously. A construction worker in a hard hat. A woman in a hospital volunteer vest. A man in a maintenance uniform. All of them snapped to attention. All of them held that same posture. All of them had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. The trauma team kept working, unaware that the world had just shifted on its axis. Rachel's voice came out level. Get him to Trauma 1. Activate massive transfusion protocol. Type O negative, 6 units standing by. It was not a request. It was a command delivered in a register none of these doctors had heard from the temp nurse they'd been ignoring for 3 months. The resident hesitated for exactly 2 seconds before moving. The nurses jumped. The attending physician, not Caldwell, thank God, turned and said, "You are fired. Your security risk. I don't care what your story is." "I'm aware," Rachel said. "Are we saving this man or are we going to stand here debating my employment status?" She was already moving toward Trauma 1. Her hands had done this before. Her hands had done this in sand and blood under mortar fire. Her hands remembered everything. The doors burst open 30 seconds later. Not EMTs this time. Men in dress uniforms. The insignia on their sleeves read Coast Guard, and the man leading them wore 3 gold stripes, a vice admiral, the kind of rank that made hospital administrators stand up from behind their desks. Beside him was Commander Vega, his face rebuilt from the grief of watching his son code, now rebuilt again from something else entirely. Determination. Recognition. Behind them came a man Rachel had not seen in 7 years. A man whose face had aged in ways that spoke of classified briefings and impossible decisions. An admiral's aide, maybe. A government liaison. Someone from the part of her life that the Pentagon had promised to keep buried. The Vice Admiral's voice moved through the emergency room like a command through a radio. "Where is Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Rachel stepped out of Trauma 1, gloved hands dripping saline solution. Blood on her scrubs. The cardboard box of her civilian life forgotten on the lobby floor behind her. The Vice Admiral opened a folder. His voice climbed the ranks like steps on a military ladder. Bronze Star. Silver Star for the extraction operation at Jolan District, Ramadi, under sustained enemy fire. Second Silver Star during the recovery of 17 American service members from a compound that intelligence said was abandoned. He paused. Each medal hung in the air like a weight. 2 Purple Hearts. And a Navy Cross, presented posthumously because your entire unit was declared killed in action to protect the operational security of a mission the Pentagon needed to disappear. Rachel did not flinch. She did not move. She had known this was coming since she heard the word Seahawk. She had known the moment she chose to save a commander's child instead of protecting her own invisibility. Then Commander Vega's 8-year-old son stepped forward. Daniel. The boy with the hole in his heart, now patched and healing. He looked up at the assembled military brass, at the Admiral, at the security guards, at the entire emergency room watching, and he said something that made a Navy Vice Admiral blink. Miss Rachel came to my bed every night when everyone was sleeping. She checked my bandages. She held my hand when I had bad dreams. She never told me she was a hero. She just kept me alive. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in Trauma 1, still running, still delivering oxygen to the gunshot victim whose code name had shattered everything. That was when the handcuffs clicked. FBI agents emerged from the elevator, badges gleaming like accusations. Behind them, flanked by 2 federal marshals, was Dr. Caldwell. His face had drained to the color of old concrete. His hands trembled, actually trembled, as the agents led him forward. His mouth was moving but nothing coherent emerged. The senior FBI agent spoke directly to the hospital administrator. Dr. Caldwell attempted to forge termination documentation and hide evidence of fraudulent billing practices spanning for years. When we identified the timeline inconsistency, we subpoenaed the digital records. He tried to alter the metadata. That's a federal crime. That's conspiracy. That's witness tampering. Caldwell's voice cracked. This is insane. I was protecting the hospital. She's a security risk, You're under federal arrest, the agent said. The handcuffs tightened. His lawyer would advise him to stay silent. He did not stay silent. She was just a temp nurse. She had no right to question my protocols. She was nobody. She was nothing. His voice had abandoned composure entirely. It was the sound of a man watching his entire construction of authority collapse into dust. I was protecting the institution. She's a liar. She falsified her credentials. She's a phantom. The Master Chief Petty Officer stood motionless, watching him spiral. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The Vice Admiral was already reading from declassified documents. The commander was already preparing a legal team. The Coast Guard aide was already on a secured phone line. And in Trauma 1, the surgeons were already extracting the bullet from the translator's abdomen while Rachel's technique, the technique that only Coronado graduates learned, was already keeping him breathing. 6 months passed. Commander Vega's wife was getting coffee at a strip mall in northeast Philadelphia when she spotted him. Dr. Caldwell. He was sitting at a folding table with a sign that read Supplemental Medicare Insurance Solutions. The nameplate on the table said Steve. He flinched when a customer called him doctor. His hands were shaking slightly. He was wearing a polo shirt with a company logo on the breast. Behind him, framed in cheap plastic, was his medical license. Still valid. Still expensive. Still utterly useless. He was selling insurance from a folding table to people who could not afford him anymore. At Cedar Creek Medical, on a Friday morning in October, the annual hospital ceremony took place in the new pediatric wing. The wing that bore a bronze plaque, the Torres Wing for Veteran Healthcare Excellence. The plaque had no explanation. People would wonder about it. People would ask. And eventually, they would understand. Rachel stood in her dress blues. The uniform still fit. The rank still held weight. The challenge coin, no longer tarnished, now polished to a mirror shine by someone who understood the meaning of such objects, was pinned to her jacket just above her heart. She was pinning a challenge coin to the uniform of the pediatric wing's first nursing graduate. A young woman named Maria, fresh out of the program, ready to spend her life saving children. Rachel's hands were perfectly steady as she attached the pin. The room was full of hospital staff, administrators, and military personnel. Nobody in this room would ever underestimate a nurse again. "Do you have any words?" the hospital president asked. Rachel looked at Maria. She looked at Commander Vega, whose son was sitting in the front row wearing a shirt his doctors said he'd never live to wear. She looked at the security guard who had snapped to attention in a lobby. She looked at the translator in Trauma 1, still healing, still alive because a temporary nurse had refused to let him die. "The quiet ones are always dangerous," Rachel said. "Not because they're hiding something, but because they're done asking permission." The ceremony ended. The crowd dispersed. And Rachel Torres returned to her shift in pediatric intensive care, still in scrubs, still checking vitals, still choosing the patient over the power. Because that was the choice she'd always made. In Ramadi under fire. In the lobby with a cardboard box. In the operating room when someone needed to live. The challenge coin caught the light as she leaned over a child's bedside. The boy asked her name. She told him. She did not tell him what she'd survived. She did not tell him about the Pentagon or the erasure or the moment when the world finally recognized who she'd always been. She just held his hand and promised he'd be okay. And because she was the woman who kept promises even when the entire military-industrial complex tried to bury her, he believed her. A month later, the hospital announced a new position, Chief of Trauma and Emergency Medicine. The board offered it to her with a salary that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Rachel turned them down. She asked to remain a nurse. She asked to keep working in pediatrics. She asked to stay in the place where children learned whether the world was safe. And when the board president asked her why, she gave him the answer that would eventually define her public legacy. "Power is not a title," she said. "Power is the ability to help." If you ever find yourself working in a place where the quiet person knows something nobody else knows, the smart move is to listen. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who earn their respect not through rank, but through the refusal to let people die on their watch. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know what you were capable of.